All right, so basically we're going to be talking about master file creation and workflow in Photoshop. And what we're going to be focusing on today is really more a conglomeration of the last three the one-on-one classes that we've done. So those that don't know me, why should you listen to me? I've basically been in this business since I had hair, as you can see from this picture. Started out in the whole 1 hour lab craze, came out here for surfing and fell into the whole post-processing thing back in the late 70s, early 80s. In 1984, we formed Watts Color Lab, which is Princeton enlarged some slides. You can tell this is an oldie but a goodie. That little bottle, white bottle there, is a bottle of film cleaner. So that, that's that celluloid stuff that we used to use. But a lot of these principles are the same. This is a color photographic enlarger, analog. We got digital grain focusers. I'm sorry, we've got critical grain focusers and all that kind of nonsense. But paper processor back over here on the right in 2001. They kind of rocked our world, the whole industry. We went basically from analog to digital. And so these are just some pictures of the light jet line down here on the left-hand side. That's that processor for the light jet current right now, as it sits right now. That is actually a darkroom in there, and these are the light jet printers. And they print with light, not with ink. They're not inkjet printers. They are actually a sensitive metric product that has to be exposed to light with a red, green, and a blue laser, and then exposed and then processed in chemistry. We've already kind of covered this a little bit too, but how best to learn these Photoshop through these meetups. You attend all four Photoshop one-on-one meetups. I know that quite a few people on this list so far have already been to most of these meetups, so I think you're going to find this kind of a nice culmination of what we've covered in the first three one-on-one classes. Homework, I suggest 1 hour per week at your computer with Photoshop over the things that we've touched on, and to watch the videos linked in the notes. That's really more from the last couple of the classes. We really don't have any videos associated with this. If you have any questions, please contact me. Some other optional ways to learn Photoshop, you can buy my book, and you'll hear me reference that a lot during the meetup here. Small group workshop meetups, that just kind of got put on the side with the whole COVID-19 thing. Eventually, small group workshop meetups, those will cost some money, but they're going to be highly specialized and very much more of a one-on-one type situation. And then, of course, I offer full-on print and color management services. I also, as those that know me, I'm not a real big proponent of Lightroom, but if Lightroom is an integral part of your workflow, then you need to decide on two possible workflows for how you're going to work with your images. And if you're using Lightroom, you're going to use the develop module to make those adjustments raw that need to be made, which we talked about in class 3. And like it says up here, Lightroom develop module and the Adobe Camera Raw plugin that's accessed through Photoshop are virtually the same. There's 2 or 3 more features available in the develop module that really aren't that hooey. The second way, the 2 possible workflows, Lightroom, edit, then send it to Photoshop, which is what this number 1 is. Number 2 is the one I'm going to be working with tonight with the library. I use Bridge, just so you know. I don't use Lightroom because I don't need the power that it offers. So basically what you see in this red box is what we're going to do tonight. If I have an Adobe Camera Raw file, which most of these are, then I'm going to open them in Adobe Camera Raw and then work on them in Photoshop, which is essentially the same workflow as this up here in number 1, but that's the one I'm going to suggest. You can look for a couple of resources on that coming out in the next couple of days, because I'm going to post a blog post on how to get your images from Lightroom to Photoshop and back. Most of what we're going to be working on tonight is, of course, the master file. And as you can see, in fact, we can go ahead if you want. You can go to the notes, which is on page 1. And the master file is not for every image. In fact, I don't suggest that you bring every image into Photoshop. I only suggest that you bring those images into Photoshop, which you are planning on building a master file around. The master file is where you're going to pour all of your blood, sweat, and tears into it. All your creative mojo, if you will, is going to go into the master file. We're going to spend a lot of time on these first 4 steps that you see on the left-hand side over here, as well as the master file and saving them. I'm not going to spend much time in the cropping or any of that. I just want to get you used to the fact that once you create and pour your creative mojo into the master file, you can go crazy at the right-hand side. That's procedural as far as cropping and what have you. So On page 1, it talks about why a master file. We've covered this multiple times. If you're not familiar with that, because of the constraints of time, I'm going to kind of breeze through this PowerPoint just so you know. If you're not familiar with the master file, read through that on page 1 when you got a little more time. Again, if you got any questions, then please email me, and I'm sure that we can get to it. The next thing is on page 2 is the basic elements of a good color print. And these are the kinds of things that you want to keep in mind when you're building your image. So you're going to hear a lot of terms that we've kind of covered in past classes, such as contrast and luminance and brightness and hue, color balance and color saturation. We're not going to do much on sharpness or cropping tonight. We might touch, no pun intended, we might touch on touch up a little bit. And then of these 8 elements, as you can see on the chart on page 2, there is a corresponding tool in Photoshop. The only one that doesn't really have one, and this is what judges look for, is this bottom one here, this impact, feel, creativity, and wow factor. That's it for the PowerPoint. I just want to go over basic elements of a good color print. And then on page 3 of the notes, talks about what makes a photograph unique, and that's that 8th element down here. Again, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on this, but I just want you to know that as a judge, there is a reason that some images will jump out at me over others. I don't know how many images I've seen of, let's say, Mount Soledad, but the ones that have a unique angle or there's something a little bit unique about that compared to a snapshot, those are the ones that will draw a judge's eye if you're thinking from a contest standpoint. So what I'm going to do is I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I got 9 images. Everybody that sent images in should have an image represented here. So what I'm going to do, if you want to go to page, let's see, let me go through page 4 here. If you've got page 4 open, the workflow is on the next couple of pages, and those you're going to want to refer to. That's on page 5 and 6. But the workflow chart is essential element on how best to approach and use your Photoshop program. It's important to standardize your workflow, I guess is what it boils down to. So now you'll notice that the workflow chart on page 5 and 6 is divided into 4 sections. We're going to spend a lot of time on the first 3. Open your file in Adobe Camera Raw, optimize file in Adobe Camera Raw, and optimize master file in Photoshop. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on cropping and working with your file and master in Photoshop, just because I want to get through the basics of creating a master file for all 9 of these images. And if I've got 10 minutes per image, that'll get us to 8:30. So that's kind of why I'm kind of rushing through a lot of this. Just so you know, I'm going to be referring a lot, and I'm not just necessarily plugging my book, but a lot of these things that I'm going to talk about tonight are in my book or in an upcoming book on layer masks. Just because of the constraints of time, I'm just going to give you a real quick overview, more not so much talking about each individual features like we have over the last 3 classes, but to give you an idea what's going on. As you can see here, I talk about speed keys, and you'll notice on the back of page 6, towards the end, at the end of page 6, we'll notice there's a list of 9 or 10 speed keys, and I consider those as the essentials. Evan asks, when is the new book expected to be available? Probably the middle to the latter part of May, and it's going to be a lot cheaper than the main book, and you almost can think of it as an addendum, a paid addendum to the main book, if you will, because it will refer a lot to the main book. So yeah, it's going to be strictly on layer mask, and you'll see a lot of that tonight, and the philosophies and the zones that I'm going to talk about, which are not discussed in the main book or the original book. So anyway, there's a link there in the notes if you want to look at the book, the cost of the book. There's also a whole bunch of targets and how to calibrate and profile your monitor on these post-processing resources link here. So let's go ahead, and that's pretty much, I think we're pretty much done with that. I've got 9 images, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to open them starting at page 5 at the top. And again, you'll notice on the left-hand side that it'll say at the top, open the file on Adobe Camera Raw, and then the middle section is optimize file on Adobe Camera Raw, and then the third section is optimize master file in Photoshop. that being the case, I'm going to take each one of these individually. These are the 9 images that we're going to work on here. Now, all of these images here are raw files with the exception of this image that I have highlighted. It's a JPEG. In the first section, it says open file in ACR, duplicate, rename, and work on your copy of your original file, which is what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right mouse click on this and click on duplicate. And you could, by the way, I should mention that I'm in Bridge, not Lightroom. I prefer the simplicity of Bridge. I've been using it for decades, so I'm really, really used to using it. And again, if you have questions about Lightroom or what have you, I'm going to have a new post coming out on that in the next week or two. There's already one on my blog, Photoshop versus Lightroom. I don't remember what exactly it's called, but basically it talks about the differences between the two and why I'm not a real big fan of Lightroom for most of the clients that I work with. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and right mouse click and I'm going to duplicate. And here's my copy right here. You can see that we have 2 of these. And I don't want to mess up my original file. So that's really why I'm doing this, whether it's raw or whatever. And you can see that it has the word copy in it. So we know that's the one I'm going to work on. So I'm going to go ahead, and now that I've done that and I've opened, it says open file in ACR, but really we're going to do the OR part in the third. Well, okay, actually, it's the third line. Basically, it says, or if the copy is not a raw file, like a JPEG here, opening Camera Raw filters. This is the exception to the rule, and I wanted to show you this because we didn't really get a chance to discuss this in the raw class last time. I like being able to use the functions that are available to me in raw, and I like to use them in Photoshop. Well, if I have a JPEG, I can't really run that through Adobe Camera Raw correctly. So I'm going to double click on this in Bridge, and it will open this image in Photoshop. So the procedure is in the book, and it mentions the page number if you're interested, page 53. Now, I strongly recommend a raw workflow, strongly. But if for some reason you're out of place and you just didn't shoot raw, whatever, you're not completely out of luck. There are still some things you can do. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to duplicate my back, and this is discussed in my book if you're interested, on page 53, and where I create a background copy. Now, we have Adobe Camera Raw, and we talked about this in the last class, where Adobe Camera Raw is a plugin that comes with Photoshop, which is where you work with your raw files. You cannot open a raw file directly into Photoshop. You have to bring it into Adobe Camera Raw first. For a JPEG, we want to be able to take advantage of the aspects of working with a raw file. So what we do is at the top, we've got, now that I've created a background copy, I'll go to Filter, and then I'll go to Camera Raw Filter. Now, Camera Raw Filter is different than Adobe Camera Raw, just so you know. 2 totally different animals. Adobe Camera Raw will allow you to work in 16-bit. Sorry, it's not made for, it's on the wrong screen. Give me just a second here. It has a lot of the same functions as Adobe Camera Raw. There we go. But you can't change the bit depth. There's no lens profiles. There's a lot of disadvantage. Plus, you're working in 8-bit, but it's better than nothing. So if you remember from the RAW class that we had things we wanted to do, goals, if you will, to aim for when working with our raw file. Most people try to make their raw file as pretty as they can, and that is not the goal. The goal is to get as much information out of it so that you can work with it in Photoshop. So if you recall, the 4 goals were low in contrast, and you see this is high, so we're going to have to get the contrast down. We also want to have it slightly oversaturated, and it is color-wise. That dog has a nice bright reddish color to it. We want to, let's see, make it slightly darker than original. Well, it's kind of contrast. We knock the contrast down. We might want to make it a little bit darker. And then the 4th is overall color balance. And you'll see that in some images where we have some skies that are different. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, and we talked about this too in class 3, that you want to work with the middle section first, this contrast, exposure contrast group. You see how each one of these are divided into 4 sections, and here's a line here, and this is the color balance up here, and then there's a edge sharpening group, and there's kind of a miscellaneous group down here. So we'll start with this because we want to work on our contrast first before we work on our color balance. If you work on your color balance first and then work on your contrast and brightness, by the time you adjust your contrast and brightness, you're probably going to throw your colors out. So the best way to work with this, and this is a feature I really wish they would put in future versions of RAW, but they're not going to, is to work on your exposure and contrast first, then work on your color. So I do not like to use the contrast slider on this so much. I clicked that by accident, my fault. What I like to do is I like to bring down the highlights, if you recall from the last seminar, and open up the shadow area, which is the same thing as reducing the contrast. And if you also recall right down here in the bottom right-hand corner, now I'm skipping over a lot of stuff that we've kind of already covered, but I need to do that in order to get to all of these 9 images and give you an idea of the overview. It'll make sense after the first few images as we go through this. In fact, just so you know, I'm on section 2 right now, optimize file in ACR in our workflow chart. And it says adjust the lens correction tab except in Camera Raw filter. We don't have a lens correction tab in the Camera Raw filter. Remember, Adobe Camera Raw filter in Photoshop is different than the Adobe Camera Raw plugin. ACR versus Adobe Camera Raw filter, two totally different things. Same functions, but they're two totally different things. So we can do our before and after here to see if, yes, we've reduced our contrast and kind of flattened it out, open up the shadow detail, and brought down the highlights. I usually like to add a little bit of texture. We talked about that a little bit. I would not do any of the other ones of these. Clarity and dehaze, I never touch. And then this is pretty saturated already, so we don't really need to kick up the saturation. So again, the 4 things we want to do is low in contrast, which it is. We definitely have brought down the highlights and the shadow and opened up the shadow detail on the face. Slightly oversaturated in color. The third thing is slightly dark. It's slightly dark. If we want to, we can bring the overall exposure down right here. I might just because. And open up the shadows a little more. Okay, and then the 4th thing is overall color balance. Well, we look for neutrals in this, and actually the neutrals are probably the floor, the neutrals being whites or grays or something with a more neutral color rather than trying to judge reds or even the whites in his or her. I love this shot. In the handkerchief, whatever you call that, the N94 mask instead of the N95. I made that up. So we'll use a little button down here to show before and after. We started with this. Okay, I think we've met our goal, so I'm going to go ahead and go to OK. Here's what we've done. We've created an image here. There's the first. That's what we started with, and I flattened that out. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is, you recall from class 2, was to adjust our contrast and our color. And I'm going to use levels and Hue Saturation to do that. And we're going to talk a lot about zones. And you'll see in the third section that optimize master file in Photoshop. So the first thing we want to do now that we've done that is we're going to go ahead. I'm going to save this file, save as, and I'm going to save this just in the same folder, but I'm going to save it as a Photoshop rather than a JPEG, which is what our instructions say to do. We pretty much have already done the optimized file in ACR. Now we're in save as a new TIFF or PSD in Photoshop with a _M. And so I'm just going to put an _M on this. Well, it says copy, but I'm going to change that. So this is now our master file. Okay, so we don't really need to divide this into zones. We don't need to, well, the next thing in line is touch up. There's nothing that we really need, well, that we need to clone out or that we really have time for tonight. It'd be nice, just so you know, in the future, if this image was going to be used to clone out all of this, the power lines back here in the upper right-hand corner. But because of constraints of time, I'm going to have to go ahead and move on. We're going to pass that next one in the workflow chart, touch up. This is again on page 5. Now the next 3, page 5, the next 3, you'll see that I've changed that a little bit. If you have the book, that box on the right-hand side is not in the book. And what it says, of course, is combine these 3 steps to divide your image into zones of brightness, contrast, and color. It's going to be the main premise of that book that's coming out in May, is how to divide your image into zones. And it's very similar to what Hsl Adjustments and Fred Archer taught with the zone system, for those of you that have been exposed to Hsl Adjustments' zone system. So what we're going to do instead is we're not going to create this into any specific zones right now because we really don't need to. And what I just said will make more sense when you see some other images coming up that will make sense of these zones that I'm talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a levels adjustment layer. Like we talked about in the class 2, I'm going to adjust my contrast and check my clipping and what have you. So you can see here's before and there's after, and we definitely have a lot more pop to this image. Remember, here's what we started with. So the first thing we did is we flattened it out to get more information into it by using the Camera Raw plugin, not Adobe Camera Raw because this is a JPEG. This is what the second background copy it's called here. This is what that second layer is. Then the third layer is just an overall using an adjustment layer globally, adjusting our contrast. Now, when I look at this, I also see that the red in the dog is a little electric, so I think we need to desaturate the red. So what I did is I created a Hue Saturation adjustment layer. And by the way, I created these adjustment layers either using the adjustments panel here and or you can use the little yin yang symbol here, and there's actually more in this list than there are in the adjustment panel. But the adjustment panel does give you kind of an idea of what's going on. It's really the more popular one. So like we talked about in that class 2, I'm going to desaturate the reds so that it's not quite so electric. Here's before and after. And remember, we're using the eyeball to do before and after. And if we do the eyeball and turn the layer off here, it will also turn it off in the layers panel, which we talked about. So here's after, here's before. You can see what I'm talking about. Instead of going, we're just trying to make it less Andy Warhol, I guess is a way of putting it. The reds here are so electric that it looks fake. Here, the reds, at least on my calibrated and profiled monitor, look pretty calibrated. Let's see. Let me see. Evan wrote something here. Right? I don't understand how flatten the export into the image, then it's present the original raw image. Okay, Evan, if you can read what he said here, perhaps we can discuss this privately after class. But I don't understand, he said, how flattening the image in ACR brings more data into the image than is present in the original raw image. Real quick, Evan, basically what it boils down to is this. We have a huge bucket of colors that we've collected in Adobe Camera Raw. And if you have an image that has is slightly overexposed or slightly underexposed or has a zone that's much brighter in the sky versus the foreground, let's say, when you flatten it out, you're able to bring in more detail on the highlights and more detail in the shadow. And that's what flattening is going to do. You'll see more examples of that as we go along. If that doesn't make sense, yeah, we'll talk about it afterwards. Okay, so the only other thing, let's get back to this image here. The only other thing I would want to do to this one before I'm ready to call this a master file is I want to bring out a little brightness in the dog's face here. So I'm going to create a separate adjustment layer. You can see this is the layers panel over here on the right-hand side. And here's that layer I just created. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make everything black. Now, you may recall we've talked about this. Black hides the effects of your adjustment and white reveals the effects of your adjustment. So right now, nothing is coming through on this layer. I can't adjust anything because it's saying there's nothing to adjust. It's black. In fact, there's no histogram. All I'm going to do is I'm going to create a white area around the dog's face using the brush tool. And this is discussed a bit in the book there. It shows what, page 63, I believe it is, selection tools, adjustment layers, and layer mask. Now that I've created this, I'm going to paint on that layer mask using the brush. And you paint with your foreground color, which is white. And when I do that, white reveals, and you can see, and this is something I'm going to spend a lot more time with on these layer masks in the one-on-one classes. You can see there's a lot to it that goes on. Now that I've told my adjustment layer, okay, I can now make a correction on his face only. Remember, white reveals the effects of the adjustment layer, which is levels, and black hides. So now I'm just going to take his face, I don't know if it's his or her, and I'm going to lighten just the face up. So you can see, That may be a little too much. And when it did, you can see when it changed the overall brightness on it. See how the color also did the same thing? Let me see if I can't give myself a little more. There we go. So what I'm going to do is another technique I talk about, which is I'm going to reselect that selection and I'm going to create a Hue Saturation. Now, this is essentially the same thing we talked about in class 2, which is where we're working with levels and Hue Saturation, starting with our contrast and adjusting our color. We're just doing it locally instead of globally. And again, the same thing. I think the face is just a little on the red side. So now if you see, we started with this, and now I think we got something we can work with. To me, that is pretty much done. Maybe a little still red or yellow in the dog's face. Oh, I guess it didn't take. There we go. All right, any questions on that one so far? I'm going to move on to another image. Oh, and then let's see. Enhancement, impact, dodging and burning. If I want to show you dodging and burning in other images, it would make more sense if I did. Save it. The next thing on the bottom of page 5. And by the way, we're not going to spend much time on page 6 at all. In fact, other than the 10 speed keys, which you'll see me use occasionally, then we're going to stay basically on page 5 on every image. And again, I'm doing this real fast. I don't expect you to get it all right up front, but I think that if you start kind of playing with it a little bit, using this flow chart, that it will make a lot more sense to you. And if you know people that need this flow chart, by the way, it's on that the link for the all the free uploads and stuff are on there. There's a copy of this workflow if anybody needs it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save it and find. Well, actually, I'm going to use the speed key, which is Command S, and that's listed on page 6. It's one of the very first ones you should learn. Control S in a PC, Command S. Now my image is saved, and I'm done with that one for the time being. Any questions on that image before I move on to another one? So now you can see in Adobe Bridge, I now have not only the original JPEG, I'm sorry, I have the original JPEG here, a copy of the JPEG, and the master file with the everything kind of punched up and what have you. So let's go ahead and go to the next one here. Now, for all the rest of these are raw files. That being the case, they're going to automatically, when I double click on these in Adobe Bridge, they will open in Adobe Camera Raw, which is a plugin for Photoshop. Again, it's the same as the develop module. I just strongly prefer the Adobe Camera Raw plugin for a multitude of reasons. Okay, so I'm going to double click that and open it. And this is Adobe Camera Raw. And as you can see, because it's, oh, here, let's do this. Let me hide this. Let me go ahead and make that full screen. This is a really interesting image. At first, it's so well exposed. I'm going, well, what do I want to do with this? And so what I'm going to do is because it's so well exposed, there's not a whole bunch of things that we really need to do with it. You'll notice there's some red spots up in here. That is just the clipping warning. It means that technically we're throwing out pixels in those bright areas, which would make sense. And if I go up here to the upper right, I can turn that clipping warning off. So you can see I'm really not losing much in the way of detail. So bringing that down isn't going to make a whole bunch of difference, but I'm going to just to be consistent. So I'm going to bring down the highlights and the whites until that kind of disappears, and it'll show because our histogram up here will show that that peak is starting to disappear. There, we don't have any more, technically we don't have any more clipping now. And I'll do the before and after down here. Let's see, we can probably open up the shadow detail a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry. And I should be going back up to the middle section. In fact, let me start completely over because I really blew it here. My bad. First, let's close the dog picture. I love you, dog. First thing at the top of page 5, duplicate, rename, and work on the copy original file. Well, I'm just going to duplicate it for now. I'm not going to bother renaming it. So I'm going to leave the original file alone, and I'm going to open the copy, okay? And it opens, of course, in Adobe Camera Raw. Let me go back to where I was. I brought down these. Oh, and then the next thing in that same checklist, adjust the lens correction tab. And then in the upper corner, there's a right-hand corner, there's a whole series of tabs. If you hold your mouse over it, it'll tell you what tab you're on. We want the lens correction tab, very first thing you should do. And on every image, pretty much, and we're going to see one image where it actually really makes a difference, go ahead and turn on chromatic aberration. And the second is enable profile corrections if it will let you. On this one, I don't think it does. Profile correction is built into the lens. That'll make more sense as we get into some other images. So now I'm going to go, that's the first thing. The second thing is adjust the basic tab, which is the default tab. We'll go back to that right here. And I'm going to reduce the highlights a little bit and the whites a little bit. I'm going to open up the shadow detail, maybe warm it up a little, but not much. No, not too much. That looks pretty good actually by itself. Let me go ahead and kick up the vibrance, which is one of those things I just kind of like to do. We talked about that. It's always better to be slightly oversaturated than undersaturated. And a little bit of edge sharpness. Again, of these three, texture, clarity, and dehaze, I only use the texture, and we talked about that in class 3, usually only 10 or so. And all that's doing is just making up for the failure of digital capture. I never use the clarity and dehaze sliders, never. So let's look at before and after, and I'll do the buttons down here. If you would like to know why I don't, then email me and I'll tell you why I don't use clarity and dehaze. Okay, there's before. And there's after. And we just kind of flattened it out and warmed it up a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and hit open image. And when I do this with an Adobe Camera Raw file, 3 things happen. The first thing that's going to happen is the Adobe Camera Raw plugin will close. And the second thing is it will open up in Photoshop as a master file or as a 16-bit file, which is really kind of a PSD TIFF hybrid. Even though it says RW2 right here in the file name, it really isn't still a raw file. We've worked with that already. The third thing that happens, in addition to the other two, where ACR closes, and I did make a copy, Doug. I made it in Bridge. Here's where I made the copy. Doug is asking, did I make a copy in Raw? Actually, no, I made a copy in Bridge. Or if I was in, oh, you see it now? Okay, good, excellent. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, you can see there's the third thing that happens is it creates that .xmp file in the same folder as the original file. So now all I'm going to do on this one, again, because it's such a good exposure, there's really no need for a nice even exposure. There's no need for me to break this up into zones. Well, it is, but I'm going to show you a way to I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit. And this is not something that's in the book that I'm going to show you in a minute. It's something that will be in the new book, in the layers book. So I'm going to go ahead and create a levels adjustment layer just to kick up the overall brightness and contrast on this. Now, we know I'm clipping in those bright areas, but we really don't care. I mean, in all honesty, there's no detail. And look how much better the overall image is going to look. You'll see when I'm done here. See how much it pops there? Yeah, let's see. There we go. Okay, something like that. Now, what I'm going to do, because when I look at this image, this area on the outside, it's very distracting. And those that know me, I love to darken corners, and you're going to see in some other images, I love to darken corners in images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically add some neutral density to it. I'm going to use, and just if you want to know more about this, let me know. Email me later and I will send you, even if it's just kind of a proof of what I'm doing here. I'm going to basically create a neutral density filter on the outside of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here to the yin yang symbol because this is not in the adjustments panel up here. And I'm going to create solid color right up here. And it asks me for a color. I'm going to choose black. Now, what I've done, and remember, white reveals and your adjustment layer, the effects of your layer, which is just black. That's all it is. So I want to hide all that black. So I'm going to hit Control I or Command I. So now none of that is shining through. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a brush tool, and let's see here. Let me turn off the red circle, and I'm going to paint black in here with the white. Oop, am I on the brush tool? Oh, opacity 10%. Here, let's change that. There we go. And I'm just going to change that a little bit. And again, this is not real super neat, but it doesn't really need to be. If we had more time, I would do this. Now, I'm going to, instead of making it look fake like this, what I'm doing, yeah, it is, Priscilla, you're right. Okay, now watch this. This is what's really cool. Instead of doing that, now I'm going to take on that layer while it's highlighted, this color fill layer, and I'm going to change the opacity and bring it down so that basically we're adding neutral density and let some of that through, but not so that it's fake looking. And what we got, 55, 60%. Sometimes it doesn't work this well. There's before and there's after. Now, we still have the detail on the back, but what we're doing is getting our eyes to focus on the main subject matter. To me, that image is pretty much done. By the way, of these 9 images, I'm gonna hustle along here. I am doing these basically from the easiest to the hardest in a way. Now that I've saved that, I'm gonna save this as my master file. Push the image forward. Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, I was just reading what Priscilla said. It's her image. There's some other things on a lot of these that I might spend a few more minutes doing. I'm like this corner on the right-hand side where it's fading out. I probably would darken that completely because it's kind of distracting. Okay. Any other questions on that image? Let's see, there's that. And then let me bring up Bridge again. And the next one in line is, oh, Doug, this is yours. So we're going to double click on, oh, no, I'm sorry. We're going to start over on page 5. Duplicate. I'm not renaming. I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate. And I'm not touching your original. And I'm going to open by double clicking on this. Well, obviously, we want to lighten this thing up. Okay, so we can, this is where RAW really comes in handy. One of the things Evan talked about earlier is why do we want to flatten it out? Well, we want to flatten it out because we want to bring as much information into the visible spectrum as you can. And right now, this whole image needs to be lightened up. So we can take, I'm going to start with the shadow slider right here. I'll move that all the way to the right. It doesn't do too much. So let's go ahead and go to the exposure slider, which I try to match to the midtones, okay, because I can adjust my highlights and shadows. So that's my midtone slider. So you can see already we're making a big difference. Now I'm going to go ahead. We got some highlight issues right in here. I'm going to go ahead and bring those down. Highlight slider. And what's the white slider do? Yeah, both of those would work. So actually, I have my shadows all the way open, and my because this is such an extreme exposure, and then I completely brought down my highlights and my whites, and now I'm going to open this up a little bit, maybe even reduce the contrast a little bit. Maybe that's open too much. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? Shame on me. I need to go back to the lens correction tab. That's the very first thing. I do this a lot. I forget. So don't. It's not my. It just is. Enable profile corrections. I don't think on this image it makes any difference. It does not. Okay, so I'm not going to bother. On some of the other images, it definitely will. Already, you can see a big difference in what we started with. And just kind of open that thing up just a little bit, give it some texture, about 10 units or so. Kick those colors up. Oh, yeah. See, now we're oversaturated. Remember, we want it slightly dark. It's definitely that. We want it slightly oversaturated. That's maybe a little too much. And we want it slightly dark, slightly oversaturated, low in contrast, which we definitely are. We're seeing detail in all of we weren't seeing any detail in the shadows. Now we are. And then the fourth is overall color balance, which looks pretty good. We might give it a little shot of yellow. You'll notice I don't really touch the color. Most people touch the color balance first, and that may be the very last thing I actually work with, just so you know. If necessary, adjust the detail tab. We're not going to spend a lot of time with that today. If we had some noise reduction, the detail tab, the third one over, is where I would do that using the luminance. And well, let's see. I'm just kind of curious. Let me zoom in here. Okay, yeah. See, we got some noise. You can see that pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the luminance just a little bit, kick that up 5 or 10 units. See if we can't get rid of some of that. And by the way, when you turn off this before and after toggle, it only applies to the tab that you're in. So you can tell whether we've done any noise reduction. We have, but not very much. I'm not real fond of the noise reduction in Photoshop, to be honest with you, but this is certainly better than nothing. I've been using Topaz. If you're interested in that and you have a high resolution, I'm sorry, a high noise image, then contact me and I can tell you a little bit about that. So that's looking pretty good. I think that meets our criteria. So now the last step on that second section, it says open in Photoshop. So we'll go ahead and do that. Hit open image. Again, the three things happen. Adobe Camera Raw closes the plugin, the image shows up, number two, and the third thing is that we now have an XMP file right there. Yeah. So now let's go back to this image, and then this one also really isn't going to need a whole bunch of dividing. It's just once. Yeah, it was almost dark when Doug is saying it was almost dark when he took this and probably the noise source. It was at 1600 ISO and it was real shadowy, and yeah, that is picking up a lot of that noise. And Doug, if you have a high noise image like this, there are better tools. This is one of the few times that I would not use the Photoshop product. You can see down here, I have a denoise, Topaz denoise product, which is just fabulous. I've used their other products, and of the 5 products, the denoise is superior to anything on the market, including the Photoshop, what I just showed you. The gigapixel product's okay if you got a really small image. But anyway, let's go ahead and we created an adjustment layer here. Let's just do a general adjustment layer. And I'm holding down a check for clipping. We're going to go, okay, we're clipping some blue there. It's probably a little too much. Let's bring this up and a little there. So before and after. The other thing I might do is I'm going to show you darkening of the corners in another image, but I would probably, well, here, what the heck, I'll do it right now. Oh, first thing I might do also is I might take the Hue Saturation, and the green may, or the yellow or something is maybe just a little electric, and that may just be my imagination. Let's look and see. Uh, yeah, I don't know. It could go either way. Let's just go we'll meet it halfway because I kind of like what it's doing with the tractor. So that definitely is looking better. There we go. So let me go ahead and just show you on the corners. And then again, we're now, gosh, near the second to the bottom of page 5, enhancement impact. If you got the book, I talk about this on page 89, how to do this procedurally. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new layer while holding down the Option or the Alt key in a PC. And I'm going to overlay. I've never done this in one of the 3 classes, just so you know. This is part of the layers mask class. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken the corners by painting with dark gray and light gray. If I darken the corners up here, you can see that. Let me hit tab. Tab is one of those 10 keys that you should know, one of the speed keys. It gets rid of all the panels that you have. Let's see. The other thing here is let's see if we can't lighten Mr. Skin and Bones here just a little bit. Some of these tire areas. So you can see that makes a big difference. Now we're focused. Instead of looking at the background, our eyes tend to go right to the subject matter. To me, that's looking pretty good. So here, let's see what we started. We started bringing it out of RAW. And I'm just using the history panel up here to show you before and after. We started with this, and just without even really doing anything major fancy, just to use saturation and a little burning around the corners, we got ourselves a nice image. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that, and I'm going to use a speed key, Command S or Control S. Yeah, save as unflattened. Master file talks about on the page, on bottom of page 5, and I'll put the _M here. That's just my designation for a Photoshop file, and that's my master file. And let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Okay, so let's go back to Bridge. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. And this was also a raw file, so I just double clicked on that. First thing we want to do is we want to go to the lens correction, automatically remove chromatic aberration, and enable profile corrections. Not really making a difference. I'm surprised. We've had a couple images here that they haven't made that big of a difference. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the basic tab, and I'm going to adjust my exposure and contrast first, then my color, like it says in the workflow. And first thing I'm going to do, obviously, is open up my shadow area. You can see it made a big difference over here. Now I'm going to bring down the highlights so that we don't have any, so that we do have detail in this snow. Let's bring that down, and you can see what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get my my histogram. Let me show you before. If you'll keep an eye on this, look at the histogram before and after. I'm going to show you before. Whoops. Oh, okay. There's before. You see the histogram has got a lot of, it's almost clipping on the right-hand side just a little bit. And so now you can see we've kind of compressed that into where it's still exposing to the left, but we don't have near as much. We have a lot more area to work with over here. So let me go ahead and bring those highlights. I'm going to bring them all the way down. Let me get rid of that circle. And then let's see, texture at about 10. There's a lot of color in that, but let's go ahead and see if we can't get a little more. We may have to desaturate the reds because they're almost electric here. But now we're bringing out more of the green color, as you can see in the water. Here's before and after. And that's looking pretty good, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and, well, actually, if you want, now I don't normally do this, but you could go to the fourth tab over Hsl Adjustments, and you can see got the Hue Saturation and Luminance, and we could desaturate those reds a little bit if we wanted to. Yeah, let's leave them. You know, we can desaturate them easier in Photoshop. Better to have too much and not enough. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit open. Oh, here's before and after, just so you know. Whoops, sorry, wrong. And I believe this was Drew that had this. If you're here, Drew, I didn't know if you were or not. He was concerned about the shadow detail on the left-hand side, and it's still got a lot of shadow, and it does have a lot of noise in this left-hand side. Again, I would do that with the after product because the rest of this isn't so noisy. You'll notice that the ISO on this image is really only 200 ISO up here in the right-hand corner, but when you zoom in on this area over here, you'll see that there is indeed a lot of noise in there. So that's one of those that we would want to isolate it with a layer mask and use the program to denoise that thing. So let's see here. Let's bring down the exposure a little bit. I think that meets our 4 requirements. Let's maybe warm this up just a little bit. I'm going to add a little yellow. So it's, let's see, definitely less contrasting than the original, slightly dark. It is, the color looks good, and oh gosh, I forgot what the fourth one was. Oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind. Exposure, yeah, we'll figure it out. So let's go ahead and hit open image. Oh, and oversaturated, that's what the fourth one was. Okay, I'm going to open image. Again, the 3 things happen, and when you go to bridge, you will also see the .xmp file for that. So it's created that for us. Now on this one, I'm actually going to do a little zone play. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate, this is going into the bottom section on page 5, where I'm talking about combining the 3 steps to divide your image into zones of brightness. So this is where I'm going to get into layer mask. So I don't expect you to necessarily catch on to this right away. I just want to show you what's possible. So I'm going to use a couple of tools here to create 2 zones. One is going to be the sky and the V of the mountain down in here. And then the second zone is everything else. So I'm going to use the quick selection tool, I think it's called. Yes, quick selection tool. Oh, that's the magic wand tool. Hold on a second. There it is right there. And that picked the sky, but what I'm going to do is take it a little bit further, and I'm going to go ahead and include this area here. There we go. Let's let me back up just a little bit here. There we go. And when you create an adjustment layer, and particularly when we're working with zones here, sometimes just creating that actually looks pretty good. That looks pretty much what I'm looking for. I'm going to hit the tab key so you can see what I'm talking about. It's got all of the sky selected. Plus, it's also got the this V. So that's my one zone. So now I'm going to go ahead and create a levels adjustment layer. In the next blog post, those that have my newsletter, I talked about adjustment layers being part of layer masks and how important they were. We're going to talk about two strategies to use. And I created a selection, then created an adjustment layer, and it will automatically pick or reveal what I've selected. So now what I'm going to do is immediately I'm going to reselect that. You can do that up in in fact, let me do that. I'm using speed keys and I shouldn't be, so you can see what I'm doing. Select, reselect the same selection, and immediately before I do any other thing to it, I'm going to invert it and create a second adjustment layer. Strategy says that if we make a selection and then create our adjustment layer, it will reveal. So now you can see these two layer masks over here. White reveals. So that's my sky layer mask. So any adjustment I make with levels only shows up in the sky. And there's my bottom layer mask, okay? White reveals, black hides. If I do this right, and particularly since I did them right in order, there shouldn't be any problem between the two as far as having to, make them mesh. And I mean, I can't tell you how many images we've had to turn away from a judging standpoint because of just not using layer mask properly. So this is a strategy that I'm going to discuss a lot in the next blog post, plus in my layer mask class that I'm going to be doing. We'll be spending a lot of time on this in the new book and what have you. There are touches of what I'm talking about. If you go through the sections on local and global corrections, is mentioned on page 5. It's about the third check mark up, and it talks about page 63. That whole section on layer mask talk about some of these sections. They just don't quantify it as well as they should. So now that I've got these, I can start making adjustments. So I'm going to start with the sky, and I like keeping the sky separate for obvious reasons, and you'll see that here. Now I'm on the bottom section. All right, and maybe a little bit in here. Let's see what we got here. That's looking pretty good. We may go on a little far on the sky on the blacks, but no, I don't know. It gives it a nice nifty color. But you can see now that we've got all sorts of room. Now we started with this, and we just gave it all sorts of pop, pardon me, by doing that. Now the other thing that would really make a big difference on this is again the dodging and burning, and again it talks about this a little bit in the section listed, the second check mark up on page 5, enhancement, impact, dodging, and burning on page, well, I can't even see what page it's on. So I'm going to do that real quick just so you can see. I'm sorry, I didn't want to do that. Let's, there we go. Again, if y'all have any questions, just go ahead and use the chat. Let's start with the, actually, let's start with the lightning in this area over here. Let's see if we can get that any lighter. Oh, yeah, we definitely can. Okay, so let's go back to this. We lighten this. You can see before and after how we just kind of dodged and burned. So now I'm going to also do the corners. Then I'm going to get on these last ones before we run out of time here. So you can see what a difference that makes right there, just to kind of bring stuff out a little bit. Again, not perfect at this point, but I'm going to save them just to give everybody an idea of what I'm doing. Okay, any questions on this one here? So let's see here. Let me save this as a master file. And there we go. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, let's. This is Drew. I think is the photographer's name. I'm not sure if he's here. And actually, looking at this image, I probably would have spent a little more time desaturating the reds. I think they're just a little hot, but I want to get to these other ones here too before we run out of time. Okay, let's see here. What's next? Oh, Karen, it's yours is next, as a matter of fact. So I'm going to double click that. Oh no, you know what? Normally I would duplicate. I'm not duplicating because we're running out of time. Okay, I know you guys have got these somewhere. That's the main reason for doing this. First thing we want to do, we want to reduce the contrast, and we have a lot of shadow detail that's getting lost in the truck. So I'm going to open that shadow detail all the way. I'm going to bring the highlights down and the whites. And again, the color, I don't think I would change. We've been real lucky with the color, but you guys are good photographers, so that's why. Oh, the other thing I didn't do, which I will do, is I'm going to go over here to the lens correction tab and enable the profile correction because it made a difference on this one. It did. Yeah. Good lens and a good profile. You'd have to ask Karen where that was taken. Karen, I take it this was taken at Bodie? Yeah, it was. She just said, yes, it was. Let's go ahead and go back to the basic tab. And I'm going to bring the exposure down a little bit. And I'm actually going to reduce the contrast even more. There are a couple things, just so you know, we talked about this in the raw class, that I hardly ever touch. I almost never touch the saturation. I never touch the clarity and the dehaze key, and I rarely touch the contrast. And if it is, it's almost to lower the contrast, not to increase the contrast. I can increase the contrast and give it lots of snap in Photoshop. I want that information. I don't want any clipping in this histogram. I want most of this histogram in the upper right hand corner to be about where this is here. I mean, basically, most of your values should be in the middle to the left. Here's what that histogram looked like before. And see how it's all spread out. We want to compress that and flatten that image out. So that's kind of what's going on there. We'll add a little texture to it. Definitely, we want to add some color punch to it. Let's see, that actually looks pretty good. Let's see, maybe we'll add a little yellow. So I'm going to click up there. Yeah, there we go. So here's what we started out with before, and here's where we're headed. So I'm going to go ahead and hit open image. And of course, it closes Adobe Camera Raw, opens the image in Photoshop, and in Bridge, it will create an XMP file for us right here. All right. At that point, I'm gonna quickly divide this into. I like dividing anything I see with a sky in it into zones. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Let's see here. I'll use the quick selection tool. This is an easy zone to split. So if I take the look, there's done. It just picked our first selection for us using the quick selection tool. And the quick selection tool is discussed in the book, by the way. Okay, so now that I divided that into the top zone, I'm going to create an adjustment layer. And you can see that the adjustment layer, because I made the selection first, and again, I'll talk about this in the next blog post, it's only going to reveal the sky. So that's all it's going to work on. Immediately, I'm going to go to select menu, select, and create another. Well, I'm sorry, my bad. Select menu, reselect, and then select inverse. I want to pick everything else. So now you can see the marching ants around the bottom and create another levels adjustment layer. It doesn't make a difference which one I start with. I'm going to start with the sky first and see what we can get out of that. Oh yeah, nice and punchy. Look at there. It's too saturated, but we can change that. but I like the contrast and the way that sky is popping. Now I'll go to the bottom and do the same thing. And to do that, I just activate this adjustment layer over here with that layer mask. And I'm using levels. So the same thing. At first I thought I was going to have to isolate the truck, but I'm not. It came out looking really, really nice. But most of that's because we were able to do some stuff in Adobe Camera Raw and flatten it out. Now, if I want to make the sky less blue, and I do, I'm going to reselect that layer mask. Does it matter that you did not select the top of the gas pump? No, it doesn't. I prefer, Gordon is asking this, I prefer that you don't. I would prefer that the gas pump top be separate from the sky, which is where it is now. So now I'm going to create a Hue Saturation layer on the sky because I want to desaturate those blues a little bit. They're a little electric to me. And the only other thing on this one, I think there's two things I would want to do, and I mentioned this earlier, is making a neutral density, because to me, and I'm going to zoom in on this stuff here on the labeling of this truck is really, really detracts from it. So I'm going to do the same thing I did on, I don't remember which one it was, where I blocked, it was Priscilla's, the circular mirror. And I'm going to basically create a neutral density filter, all black. And I'm going to fill this in. And like I said, what I'm showing you is not in the book. It'll be in the next book. But if you email me, I could probably be forced to send you something, because it'll force me to get to finish that section. I'm just going to kind of color this in. I could make it nice and neat if I wanted to. I'm not going to, because of the constraints of time. We still have some images to get to. And then what I would do is change the opacity to where it's not quite so standing out-ish, I suppose is a good way. And yeah, I would need a little touch up around the corners to make that work. So now when you look at this image, the first thing that comes out at you is the Shell station signs, not the sign that says it's a 19 whatever. And then the last thing I would do on this one is I would, of course, do a little dodging and burning in the corners. Again, just kind of something that I tend to do a lot. Let's see. That's probably too much. Let's, well, actually I can do too much, and then I can back off the opacity of that layer if I need to. Okay, and then take this and back it off just a little bit to where it's, all we want to do is just we want to focus on the truck. See how what happens? It's an old Hsl Adjustments trick, and it's been around forever, and most people have forgotten how to do it. But to me, that little touch makes all the difference in the world, because now our eye, instead of wanting to go all over because the overall image is bright, it's now want to focus on the truck and the signs. And I might even take a brush and this area over here just a little bit. On something like this, it's probably not necessary to create a separate layer mask. Not my neatest job, but you get the idea. With more time, I would definitely be able to make that so you couldn't even be able to tell that I've lightened that up. Okay, so let's save that. And I'll put an _M on that for master file. And again, see, that's the nice thing about the master file. If we need, let's say Karen likes this image, she goes, well, go ahead and finish it. I'll come back and spend 5 minutes and neaten up where I've dodged and burned on the gas pump. Let's see what else we got. Okay, Gordon, I think this is yours. It is. Oh, and this will actually help us introduce a new feature in Photoshop that came out a couple of versions ago. Maybe it was only one version ago. Okay, first thing we want to do is we want to bring down that background. All right. Just bring the overall exposure down till we got more detail on the back. Open up the shadow area. Bring it down even more. Even reduce the contrast. Oh, darn it. Sorry, I forgot to go to the first thing in the flowchart under that section, adjust the lens correction. And I do that a lot. I don't know, maybe it's just, and it actually makes a bit of a difference. Brings the bird a little closer. So we'll do that. It opens up some shadow area too. Okay, let's do that and bring the overall exposure down. I'm not sure about warming it up. We'll wait until we get this into Photoshop, and definitely want to punch up some colors, so we'll give it some vibrance, particularly that electric blue on the throat. So here's what we started with, and here's what we're ending up with, and getting all that detail. So the nice thing about RAW, in fact, if you look at the histogram, I'm going to turn it off and watch the histogram now. You can see how it's really hot on the right-hand side. What we've done is we've reached into that bucket of RAW to bring some of those values back into the visible spectrum. And you can almost think of the histogram as the visible spectrum, if you will. So I think that's going to work for us, and it meets all those criteria. I'll hit open image. What I want to do is I want to divide this into zones. And to do that, I'm going to choose the bird and then everything else. There's a little trick, but you have to have an adjustment layer created to do that. Otherwise, it won't work. And this is not in a book. It will be in the layers book. But in the meantime, Google select subject. There's actually a tool for this too. If you click it, it's pretty smart. Watch what happens. Let me go ahead this is on my background copy. For some reason, and I haven't figured this out, let me go back in history. If I have the background copy and highlight on it, it's not in there. There has to for some reason, there has to be a layer, even if you're not using it, active on top. I may delete it, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Select subject and watch this. Voila, our bird is selected. Now that I've done that, I don't need this one. I'm just going to delete this. And I'm going to go straight to a selection. It shows our bird. Immediately go ahead and reselect it and select inverse and get everything else. All right, so we'll start with that background. Let me make that a little smaller so everybody can see it. And we can get a lot more background in this. And then let's go back to the bird itself and give it a little punch. We still want to be able to see all that mid-tone detail. And that's looking pretty good. I didn't realize it's picking up some really nifty colors in the I don't know, it's chest. I don't know what this part is here, but it's got some really nifty colors in there. And there's before and after. Now, one of the things I would probably do on this one is the same thing where I would create a levels adjustment layer, but invert it. When you create an adjustment layer, by default, it reveals everything. If you click at the layer mask thumbnail, and this is in the book somewhere, and hit Command I or Control I, it will fill it with black so that it's revealing nothing. And if we go to the adjustment, you can see it reveals nothing. What I'm going to do is I want to go to the bird and to the eye. And so I'm going to go to brush. Let's see if it makes any difference here. Okay. I like doing this with tigers and birds and pretty much any animal except humans. It doesn't seem to look as good with them. Maybe it's because it makes them look like they're crazy. When you brighten just their eyes. Oh, there we go. See, now all of a sudden we're seeing. See, there's before and after, and now you can see the blue of the bird's eye. And I really like that. That may be a little too much, but you get the idea. We just want to bring out the color in the eye. Let's see here. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. The only other thing I do, of course, is I would definitely darken the corners on this one. Overlay. And let's see here. That's too much. It's not going to take much on this one. And I'm not even sure it really needs it, but I just want to show you that it can be done. How we're just kind of, how we're just kind of focusing it just a little bit. Okay. All right. Any questions on that one? I don't think I've done this many master files this quick in a long time. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to open both of these at the same time in RAW. You can do this by highlighting and then double clicking on bridge, and you'll see that both of these images are here on the left-hand side. Let's start with this one here, and I'm going to obviously reduce the highlights. We want to get as much detail out of the sky, even if it's a hazy day. We want to get as much detail out of that sky as we can. Oops, shame on me. Let's go up here. There we go. And I want to do the same for this image here while I'm thinking about it. All right. Let's go back to this image here. I think this is a great way to teach online and watch you do this. Repetition will help us. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think I'm going to start doing more of these. These are kind of fun. Let's see, we don't really need to open up the shadow detail. If anything, we need to bring this whole thing down. So it's just a little bit darker. Remember, that's what we want to do, is slightly darker, low in contrast, slightly oversaturated, and I can do that by increasing the vibrance a little bit. And then best overall color balance. It's got a little pink in here, but if I correct for the pinkish colors in here, it's going to make the sky more pink, and I don't want to do that. That's why I say best overall color balance. I'm going to leave it alone, and if we still have a pinkish balance down here, we'll isolate that and correct that. So I think that one's pretty much ready to go, but before I hit open, I want to go ahead and do the raw work on this one too, just because we're starting to run out of time. First thing, because it's snow, I am moving the highlights and the whites all the way to the left, and then I'm going to start moving my exposure down. I don't remember who the photographer is on this, and there's a lot of really good images that you sent me, by the way. But anytime, and there were a lot of snow pictures, but look at all the color that we're starting to get before and after, and you can see the histogram in the upper right hand side here, how it's starting to clip. And as soon as I start working with it, I'm bringing all those values that I want into a visual area. Okay. Let's see, the texture, if I was going to, it's not really that this is colorless. It's not in any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of green values up in here by Bridal Veil. The nose El Cap has got a nice, nifty, warm color to it. And in fact, I can even bring that down just a little more and open the shadows a little more. Heck, I can even decrease the contrast and bring it down a little bit. There we go. All right. But because we shot this, or because she shot this in RAW, we've got this information. Now I'm going to highlight both of these images, and actually I'll just do select all. This is if you have more than one RAW file open. And instead of open image down here, since I picked both of them, it's going to open images. It will open both of these. Let me put this one off to the side for a second. And on this one here, I'm going to do a quick selection tool, and I'm going to, again, do it into zones. And just so you know, if I had more time, whoever owns this, and I did this when I was practicing, I would probably clone out this crane. It's very, very distracting and easy to get rid of with the clone tool. So I just created one zone, and I'm going to create a levels adjustment layer. So right now, that's all that's going to be affected. I'm immediately going to reselect that selection. Then I'm going to invert that selection. Both of those commands are in the select menu, and create a levels adjustment layer for just the bottom. So now I got that divided up into zones. Let's see what we've got. And let me bring this down a little. Oh, that's not going to work. I want to hold the detail, but I don't want it to look so hazy and overcast, and it's going to be really, really tough to do on this one. Let me go ahead and work on the bottom, and I've got an idea on something we might try. Yeah, we're getting there. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to reselect that sky, and I'm going to cheat with something called, oh, it's the same thing. It's called solid color. What I'm going to do is, instead of choosing a black, is I am going to choose a sky color, a blue. Okay, let's see how close I can get. That's aqua. Yeah, that's pretty close. And then I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to back off on the opacity just to give it a little bit of color. Not much. Just so that we've got some pop to this a little bit. So I'm basically putting a filter, a blue filter, and knocking back the opacity. Instead of 100%, it's only, well, it was just a little bit. It was whatever it is up here, 35%, 30%. So we got a lot nicer image. So we're definitely headed in the right direction on that one. On this one here, when I was practicing on it, one of the things I really noticed is that it really was susceptible to the burning, the dodging and burning of the corners. So let me do that. We'll start with, where are we at? 117. Oh, perfect. Okay. And then particularly down in here. All right. Then maybe open up this area below the village, smidgen. And again, this is all just with the dodging and burden tool. You can see what a difference that makes. Now we're real close on that one. Yeah, and Gordon's saying I like the filter technique, so you can also apply this to the reflection in the river water. It really only works when you have a neutral color like the sky. Okay, I don't know that would work. See how the sky's already a neutral color to begin with, Gordon, and so it works because we're starting with basically a neutral palette, but we've already got some color in the river. That's not to say you couldn't play with it, but I mean, all I'm trying to do is just kind of help out here a little bit for what was obviously a very, very tough shooting condition. The weather sometimes doesn't always cooperate, and so sometimes we can change that to make things better. Okay, let's do one more here and then we'll call it a night. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, last but not least, this is kind of an interesting mask. We're going to have to actually use two tools to make this. No, actually, we're not. Yes, actually, we are. I take that back. We're going to start with the quick selection tool, and we're going to choose the sky until we get over to where it stops. Okay, and you can see that it's stopping right over here. Now I'm going to use the magic wand tool, and we talk about this in the book also. And I'm going to pick these areas in here, but I need to turn off the contiguous so that it picks all the blue values in this image. I want to get all these little spots in the trees is what I'm trying to do. Now, yeah, you can see it picks some stuff down at the bottom, down in here. So what I'm going to use after I picked all these areas in the trees, because we want these to shine through as part of that layer mask. Now I'm going to take the lasso tool and I'm going to subtract all those areas down below here that I don't want to be part of that zone, which is the sky. All right. If I choose that, then you can see that it's picking the vast majority of the areas that he wanted, including all those little areas up in this upper left-hand corner that wouldn't have gotten picked by any other tool but the lasso tool. I'm sorry, the magic wand tool. So now I'm immediately repick that, reselect, select inverse, and it'll pick everything else. And then I'll do that down here. And let's start with the sky. So let's go ahead and see what we can get out of the sky. Ooh, look at there. There's actually some blue sky in there. And I bet the photographer didn't even know that. Okay, so I want to go ahead and take care of the bottom. Now, one of the things that I'm noticing down here below is it's got kind of a bluish cast to the snow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new, actually, I'm going to create the selection from this levels right here. And then I'm going to do the Hue Saturation, and let's see how much blue is actually in there. Ooh, a lot of blue. Okay, so maybe we can get rid of some of that blue. None of it's really important to kind of make the snow a little more neutral and make the sky stand out a little more. Here's before and after. In fact, for that matter, we can do the same thing with the sky. Maybe punch up the blue a little bit. Let's see, with the same Hue Saturation. Yeah, yeah, that's looking pretty good. We haven't even done any dodging or burning or anything. Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Victoria. And I like that, Priscilla. Thank you and good night. Sounds like a rock star, right? Thank you and good night. So I hope that helps, guys. Talk to you guys later. Have a good one. Oh, leave a good review if you can. Okay, bye.